In another extremely cold 541st year, Velizarius, the glorious commander of the empire, returned to the capital and appeared before his emperor. Despite the treasury of the Ostgoths, which the Greeks took out of Ravenna, numerous trophies, including King Vitiges, the commander did not receive a triumph. The prisoners and trophies were examined only by the emperor and his retinue, after which Velizarius was sent to war with the Persians. Perhaps Justinian never forgave Velizarius his pretended agreement to be called emperor of the western part of the empire. The level of Byzantine intrigue has always been prohibitively high, so that even if the commander and controlled through his wife and many snitches, but even a shadow of doubt in the encroachment on the throne forever changed the attitude of the emperor. Velizarius, leaving for Syria, left the capital alone. For the first time he was not accompanied by his wife, who stayed in the capital with her friend, Empress Theodora. The strange war in the east with the arrival of Velizarius consisted of the annual plundering campaigns of Shahin Shah Khosrow. After Syria, he had already managed to plunder Palestine. In this year, the Sassanids suddenly changed the direction of strike and appeared in Lazica. This was the last Transcaucasian state in which Byzantine influence still remained. Khosrow appeared under the strategic fortress of Petra, and having seized it, immediately gained full control over the whole area. The Byzantines could do nothing. They launched a couple of unsuccessful counterattacks. For several years, Lazica was ruled by the Persians, until finally the Byzantines were able to regain control over it with the full support of the local population. The fact that they tried to forcibly convert to Zoroastrianism. Zoroastrianism in general is not a very proselytizing religion. It was spread more under the influence of aggressive preaching of Christians. However, some peculiarities did not allow this faith to walk around the world. For example, the priests had to come from Persians, which closed foreign believers' growth in the spiritual hierarchy, while Velizarius trampled the dusty roads of Syria and took the border towns of Khosrow. The next year, the situation repeated itself. The Persians did not show up for the war, and in another year the matter stopped at all. Khosrow was afraid to appear in Palestine because of the ongoing plague epidemic. Velizarius was also afraid of the plague, but he came up with a cunning plan. His army camped in the desert area, and he did not enter the cities. The plan succeeded. The outbreak of the disease was avoided. Meanwhile, the plague spread like fire along the trade routes and came from Egypt to Syria, Constantinople, and Carthage. In the first year of epidemic, it has caught Justinian Great. Luckily for him, the bubo festered and the strong body of the peasant coped with the subsequent inflammation. After 3 years of confrontation with the Persians, the empire called Velizarius to return to the west, to Italy. Leaving Italy, our commander left the enemy decapitated and morally broken. King Ildibad managed no more than 1,000 Goths, who broke into gangs and roamed the north of the country, beyond the river Po. The talented strategist Uriah, in proposing Ildibad as king, counted perhaps on the help of his uncle, the king of the Visigoths. Instead, he received death. After a quarrel between wives, the king of the Visigoths first slandered Uriah in front of the other leaders and soon killed him. Soon he himself fell at the hands of one of the angry barbarians, a Gepid by birth, Velas. This bridegroom, who had been bypassed by the king, held a grudge against his lord because of the girl, and as soon as the opportunity arose, he took cruel revenge. At one of the feasts, Ildibad reached from his bed for food, and standing behind his back, Velas one blow blew his head off. After the death of the last 2 brightest representatives of the Ostgoths, anarchy began in their camp. Eraric, one of the Rugians who lived among the Ostgoths, proclaimed himself king. All that he is famous for is an embassy to Justinian, where again offered to make peace with the barbarians, but in fact the ambassador simply sold all of Italy in exchange for the title of patrician for Eraric. Eraric died before the embassy returned home. Such was the plight of the Goths, and had it not been for the inaction of the generals whom Velizarius had garrisoned in Italy, they would have been overrun like a bunch of bandits. The only one who tried to do this was Vitellius, whose garrison was closest to these barbarians, but he had so little strength that he was defeated and fled, sparing the north of Italy altogether from imperial presence. A word or two about Ildibad's uncle Theudas. The Visigoths, defeated by the Franks, were fleeing from their former places of settlement, partly to Spain, partly held near Carcassonne. The king of the Visigoths hastily strengthened his dominions. He moved the capital from place to place, waiting for the Byzantine attack from the sea. At last the Frankish kings were reconciled among themselves and moved to active action. About their campaign in Italy we have already told. It was the turn of Spain. The Franks crossed the Pyrenees through the no-man's land of the Vascones, future Basques, invaded Spain and took Saragossa. They further ravaged the surrounding countryside but were unable to build on their success. Theudis put his Duke Vitiges against them. That, avoiding battles, constrained the forces of the Franks, and they began to retreat home to the north. Suddenly, the Frankish army was trapped in the mountains. An attempt to break through the mountain passes unexpectedly failed, but Vitiges let his enemies go, taking their wagons and giving the Franks a day to pass through his barrier. Theudis, who had arrived with his army, could only defeat the rearguard of the Franks. Spain was temporarily saved, but no help to Italy could not think about. In addition, Spain was struck by the plague. As for Italy and the glorious numerous commanders Velizarius, which he had placed in all the major cities leaving for the east, they received from the capital of the new chief. Alexander, nicknamed Saladon, was not a military strategist. His talent was somewhat different. The new ruler of Italy sharply reduced payments to the army, saved on public spending, but began to fiercely seek all the reasons for the collection of any fines and arrears from the inhabitants of the province. It even came to accusations of embezzlement of Theodoric's wealth, which Alexander forced to return and appropriated to himself. Soon many of Velizarius's generals joined in the greedy plundering of the province, quarreling among themselves and no longer caring about the good of the common cause. The army of the Greeks lost its fighting ability. The soldiers no longer wished to expose themselves to danger, and the Italians finally became disillusioned with imperial authority. Finally, the Ostgoths chose a new ruler, a nephew of Ildibad, named Totila. That, seeing that the case of the Ostgoths is completely lost, had already managed to agree with the Romans that goes under the power of the empire and will serve in one of the garrisons, but having received the offer to become king, thought, "It is better to rule in hell than to serve in paradise," and decided to take a risk. Totila's condition was to kill the self-proclaimed king Eraric. This king fell at the hands of the conspirators without having time to commit any deeds, and on the same day Totila was proclaimed king of the Ostgothic kingdom. Forces at it was probably a little more than 1,000 people. Justinian, receiving reports from Italy, has accepted embassy from Eraric, has asked them about a situation in Italy, then has received news about death. Eraric and coronation Totila then began to scold the commanders. Justinian mocked in letters at their inaction and inability to end the scattered barbarians. Finally, leaving in their cities small garrisons, Bessus, John, Vitali, and other commanders led their troops to Ravenna and decided to defeat the remaining in the north of the Ostrogoths and their new king. The first thing they decided to do was to take a major city where many Visigoths lived, Verona. Then the Greek army planned to move to Ticino and catch Totila. Having settled near Verona, the Imperials, through acquaintances, found a man who agreed to secretly open the gates for them. No one wanted to go to this risky business until a volunteer was found, Artabaz, born in Armenia. He, with 100 people at dawn, burst through the open gate, and part of the people began to call the rest of the army for help, and part climbed the walls and seized them. The Goths fled the city in panic through the second gate, across the road going into the mountains. Turning around, they could see the whole city from the high ground, a handful of men at the gate and a large Roman army in the distance, in the field. The warlords, having learned of the fall of Verona, began to argue about the order of division of the spoils. Finally convinced that the Byzantine army was not moving, the Goths ran back to the city and attacked Artabazus, who was defending with his comrades on the walls. The gates were closed. The Greeks could only watch as desperate daredevils began to jump from the walls to escape the swords of the barbarians. Some of the Romans died. Some, Artabazus among them, survived. The capture of Verona failed. The commanders decided to skip point 1 and move on to the second point of their plan. At this time, Totila, having learned of the hunt for the king, himself moved to meet them. Detachments of tribesmen began to join the daredevil. and soon Totila's army was already about 5,000. Imperials outnumbered the barbarians almost 3 times, but their sluggishness allowed Totila himself to choose a place for battle and even prepare a small ambush. Before the battle there was a duel. A huge Goth named Velizarius was pierced with a spear by the same brave Artabaz. As he was dying, the Goth leaned on his spear and did not fall off his horse. The riders collided, and Artabaz himself was wounded in the cheek area. The bleeding from this wound was never stopped, so our hero weakened and did not participate in the battle and then died 2 days later. The battle itself quickly turned into a beating and defeat, as appeared in the rear of the Greeks. Mounted Ostgoths quickly sewed in the unwilling to fight soldiers' panic, and Byzantines scattered. There was a terrible beating. Totila has grasped a set of banners and a transport that before with Romans did not happen. Each of the empire's commanders fled with small detachments of bodyguards to their cities where they planned to take refuge. This resounding victory shook the barbarians, and again, as in the old days, the Germans reached for the king, so that Totila's army began to grow, and all the remaining noble and warlike barbarian leaders obeyed him and began to do his bidding. There comes a new period of Ostgothic war, revenge and revival of Ostgoths. What Totila will undertake, we shall tell in the next part.